She found a bag in a stream and didn't expect to hear faint cries of a baby. Inside was an abandoned infant who had only minutes to live. She saved him, but when the mayor arrived in town with lawyers, it became clear that the battle ahead would be not only for his life, but also for the right to be called a family. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you're watching from. The morning was still half asleep when Hannah Miller laced her running shoes, slipped her phone into the pocket of her sweatshirt, and stepped outside into the cool Texas air. The sun had not fully broken through the pale horizon, but the faint orange glow was already spilling over the rooftops of the small town. Her breath fogged in the crispness, and for a moment she simply stood on the porch of her modest house, listening to the silence before the day began. These were the moments she treasured: quiet, steady, predictable. Ever since her brother's death in a car accident, predictability had become her shield. She lived inside routines the way other people lived inside families. Running was not just exercise, it was the one place her mind could rest, where memories of twisted metal and hospital monitors faded into the rhythm of footsteps against the ground. Her route was always the same: down the narrow street, across the empty parking lot behind the grocery store, and then out toward the creek that wound behind the town like a silver thread. The water there was usually shallow, the banks cluttered with weeds and stones. Few people came that way, which was part of its comfort. Hannah liked that she could run and feel unseen, unnoticed, just a figure passing quickly through the dawn. She adjusted her headphones, turned up the volume on a playlist meant to keep her pace, and began the steady push of her legs against the earth. The town stirred slowly around her. A porch light flicked off as she passed a row of houses. Somewhere a dog barked, the sound echoing into the quiet. She kept her eyes forward, focusing on the road. The ache in her calves was familiar, the pounding of her heart a reminder that she was alive even when she often wished to feel nothing at all. For a while there was only the steady motion of her body and the air cooling the sweat on her skin. When she reached the edge of Miller's Creek, she slowed down. The water, faintly golden in the morning light, moved sluggishly between the rocks. Debris sometimes gathered along the bank branches, plastic bottles, things washed down from farther upstream. She had seen it 100 times before, but that morning something caught her eye. A burlap sack was lodged against a cluster of reeds near the center of the shallow channel, bumping softly against the stones each time the current shifted. She frowned. People dumped all kinds of things into the water, but something about the sack made her hesitate. It was too heavy to float freely, too bulky to be simple trash. She nearly kept running. Trash in the creek wasn't her problem, and she had her shift at the clinic in a few hours. But a sound pricked her ears, muffled beneath the music in her headphones. She pulled them off, letting them dangle at her side, and stood still, listening. At first it was only the trickle of water, the distant hum of a car on the highway. Then faintly, so faintly she wondered if she was imagining it, came a whimper. Her chest tightened. She stepped closer, sneakers crunching on gravel, until she stood at the edge of the bank. The sound came again, sharper this time, rising above the whisper of water. She splashed into the creek without thinking, the cold biting at her ankles as she waded toward the sack. With effort, she pulled it free from the reeds, surprised by its weight. The rope at the top was rough, tied hastily, as though someone wanted it sealed quickly. The sack moved slightly in her hands, and this time there was no mistaking the sound from within, a weak, broken cry. Her heart lurched. She dropped to her knees on the wet stones and tugged at the rope with frantic fingers. It loosened suddenly, and she pulled the opening wide. Inside, tangled in dirty cloth, was a baby. For a moment the world seemed to tilt around her. The infant was small, no more than 8 or 9 months old, with damp strands of pale hair plastered to her head. Her skin was ghastly cold, lips tinged with blue. Her eyes fluttered open, just barely, unfocused, before closing again as her chest rose in the shallowest of breaths. Hannah's training took over before her shock could consume her. She lifted the baby gently, stripping off her sweatshirt and wrapping it tightly around the tiny body. She pressed the infant to her chest, trying to share her warmth. "Stay with me," she whispered, though the words trembled from her lips as she stumbled back through the water toward the bank. The baby let out a faint sound, so small it could have been mistaken for the breeze, but it was enough. Enough to remind Hannah that this was a life, fragile and desperate, demanding every ounce of her strength. She sprinted to her car, holding the bundle close, her mind a blur of medical knowledge and rising panic. Hypothermia, possible aspiration, dehydration. She had only minutes to get the child stable. Tossing her phone onto the passenger seat, she cradled the baby with one arm and turned the ignition with shaking hands. The engine roared to life, and she sped toward the clinic, tires skidding on the damp asphalt. The drive felt endless and too short all at once. Every red light became an enemy, every second a battle she could not afford to lose. She kept one hand against the infant's chest, counting the breaths, urging them to continue. Memories of her brother clawed their way back: the phone call, the flashing lights, the helplessness as doctors shook their heads. She had failed him, but she would not fail this child. Not today. At last she screeched into the clinic parking lot, barely remembering to grab her keys before racing inside. The place was quiet, the day not yet begun. She pushed through the doors of the small emergency room, laid the baby on the nearest table, and immediately began working. Oxygen mask, warm blankets from the heater, gentle compressions on the tiny chest to coax strength back into lungs that seemed ready to give up. Minutes stretched into eternity. She checked pulse, adjusted airflow, monitored the slight rise and fall of the child's belly. Slowly, achingly slowly, color began to return to the little lips. The baby let out a weak cry, softer than any Hannah had ever heard, but it was a cry nonetheless. Relief flooded her so hard she nearly collapsed, but she kept moving, adjusting the IV, whispering encouragements that sounded strange in her own ears. It was in this whirlwind that Jacob Reeves entered. He had come with a cut on his hand, the kind of injury that normally required a quick bandage and nothing more. But what he saw stopped him in the doorway. Hannah bent over the table, sweat dampening her forehead, a trembling infant wrapped in cloth beneath her hands. For a long moment he stood silent, forgotten wound throbbing at his side, as memories of fire and smoke and a child's cries filled him. He thought of his own son, gone in an inferno he could not stop. He thought of the night spent alone in his empty house, of the silence that swallowed him whole. And as he watched Hannah fight for this fragile life, something inside him stirred. Hannah looked up briefly, startled to see someone there, but Jacob said nothing. He simply stepped forward, as if drawn by something greater than his will, and stood beside her, his presence solid and wordless. The baby whimpered again, a sound that pierced them both, and Hannah knew she was not alone in this moment. The morning sun had risen higher now, spilling through the clinic windows in long beams of light. Outside, the town moved on as it always did. Shops opening, people heading to work, unaware that inside the small building, the course of 3 lives had just shifted forever. Hannah Miller, who had built her life on routines to keep out grief, now held a child who had been thrown away like garbage. Jacob Reeves, who had resigned himself to an existence without family, now found himself staring at the possibility of redemption in the eyes of a stranger. And the baby, barely clinging to life, was already beginning to change everything simply by surviving. Hannah adjusted the oxygen mask once more, smoothing the damp hair on the infant's head. The little chest rose, fell, rose again. Against all odds, the child was still alive. Hannah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and looked at Jacob. Their eyes met briefly, unspoken questions and fears flickering between them. Neither knew yet what this discovery would mean, but both felt the same truth settling deep in their bones. Nothing would ever be the same again. The creak, the sack, the fragile cry in the dawn. These would be the images Hannah carried with her forever. She had set out for a run to silence her own memories, but instead she had stumbled into a new story, one that would bind her life to others in ways she could not yet imagine. The baby stirred in the blankets, and Hannah instinctively reached down to steady her. The warmth of that tiny body seeped through the layers of fabric, and in that warmth, for the first time in years, Hannah felt the faintest spark of hope. The hours following the discovery by the creek bled together in a haze of exhaustion and anxious focus. Hannah had remained at the clinic well into the afternoon, unwilling to let the fragile thread of life before her slip away for even a second. She had called in another nurse to handle the patients who trickled through the door, but she herself refused to leave the side of the child. The baby lay swaddled in layers of warmed blankets, a tiny figure in the wide hospital cot, hooked to an oxygen supply that hissed softly in the background. Every faint flutter of her chest made Hannah's own heart lurch. The fear of silence never left her, that the next breath would be the last, and so she remained, pacing, checking, soothing. When she tried to imagine going home that evening, the thought struck her as impossible. She could not abandon the child even for a moment. Jacob had not left either. He had stayed long after his hand had been cleaned and bandaged, lingering first by the doorway and later moving closer until he was seated in a chair against the wall. He did not speak much, but Hannah could feel the weight of his presence in the room. He sat with his hands clasped, staring at the baby with a mixture of awe and pain, as though she had awakened something he thought he had buried years ago. His silence was not indifference but reverence, and Hannah, despite her guarded nature, felt strangely less alone because of it. By the evening, the worst of the crisis seemed to have passed. The baby's temperature was rising, her color improving, her cries growing stronger. When at last she drifted into sleep, Hannah felt her own body sag, relief washing through her in a way that left her trembling. She pulled up a chair and sank into it, never letting her gaze leave the child's face. Jacob shifted beside her, his rough voice breaking the stillness when he said quietly that she would pull through, that he could see it in the way she fought. Hannah did not answer, but she knew he was right. The baby had survived something no one should have, and there was strength in that small body that belied its fragility. The days that followed took on a rhythm of their own. Hannah did not plan it that way, but her life quickly narrowed to the cycle of feeding, monitoring, and watching over the little girl. Every 2 hours she prepared formula, testing its warmth against her wrist before guiding the bottle to eager lips. She learned the subtle difference between cries of hunger and cries of discomfort, how to adjust her hold to soothe the child into calmness. Each task, once foreign, became instinct. She found herself smiling unconsciously when the baby stirred and reached up with tiny fists, as though demanding reassurance that someone was there. Jacob became part of this rhythm too. At first his role was hesitant, almost reluctant, but as the days stretched on, he proved himself willing to do whatever was needed. He learned clumsily to change diapers under Hannah's patient direction, fumbling with the tabs but persisting until he succeeded. He cradled the baby in his strong arms, awkward at first but slowly more confident, until the sight of the rugged mechanic humming tunelessly to lull her became almost natural. More than once Hannah found herself watching him when he thought she was not looking, struck by the gentleness hidden within his weathered exterior. It was during one of the early mornings when the baby fussed against her blankets and refused to settle that Hannah spoke aloud what had been circling her thoughts. "She needs a name," she said almost to herself. "We can't just keep calling her the baby." Jacob, seated nearby with his hands resting on his knees, nodded. The room was quiet save for the infant's soft whimpers. Hannah looked down into the small face, saw the spark of life fighting its way forward after so much darkness, and whispered a single word. "Hope." The sound of it seemed to fill the room with something warmer than the heated air. Jacob repeated it softly, as though testing its weight. "Hope." The baby blinked up at Hannah, as though recognizing the syllables, and gave a faint coo. It felt, for the first time, as though the child was no longer simply a survivor of some nameless cruelty, but a person with a future that could be shaped. Hope. The name settled over all three of them like a quiet promise. As word spread through town, people began to notice the unlikely pair who now seemed inseparable from the infant. The sight of Hannah, usually so self-contained, carrying a bundled child through the market or standing outside the pharmacy with a diaper bag slung over her shoulder, drew both admiration and gossip. Some whispered that it was a miracle, others that it was improper. Hannah heard the murmurs but refused to let them touch her. For the first time in years, she had something stronger than grief to occupy her heart, and the opinions of others seemed smaller than ever. Jacob, too, faced questions. Men at the garage ribbed him good-naturedly about his sudden role as caretaker, while others offered concerned glances, wondering if the burden was too much. He brushed off their words, though inside he wrestled with the ghosts of his past. Every time he held Hope and felt her tiny fingers curl around his thumb, he was reminded of the child he had once lost. The ache was sharp, but with it came an unexpected healing, as though by protecting this little girl, he was reclaiming some part of himself. Not all reactions were kind. At the diner, Hannah overheard two women murmur about how strange it was. A young doctor and a widowed mechanic playing house with a baby that wasn't theirs. The words stung, but when she returned home and found Hope babbling happily in Jacob's arms, she realized such judgments no longer mattered. The life in front of them mattered more than the whispers behind their backs. Yet the fragile peace could not last. On the third evening, Sheriff Carter came to the clinic. He was a steady man, weathered by years of small-town disputes and the occasional larger crisis, and he entered with the heavy step of someone carrying news he would rather not deliver. Hannah listened as he explained that word had reached his office about a missing infant. The description was vague, but the timing was too exact to ignore. Someone was searching, and not just anyone. The name on the inquiry was Richard Dalton, the mayor. The moment hung heavy between them. Hannah looked down at Hope sleeping soundly in her crib, her tiny chest rising and falling with perfect peace, and felt fear claw at her stomach. Jacob's jaw tightened as he stood with his arms crossed, his expression a mask of defiance. The sheriff admitted he did not yet know the details, only that powerful people were asking questions. He left them with a warning to be careful, his eyes lingering on the child as though he too wished the world were simpler. After the sheriff was gone, the small clinic room felt changed. The air seemed sharper, the shadows deeper. Hannah sat at the edge of the crib, brushing a finger across Hope's cheek, and knew instinctively that the days ahead would not be easy. She had thought the greatest battle would be against death itself, fought in the silence of the emergency room. But now she realized the true struggle was only beginning, one that would test not only her skills as a doctor, but her strength as a woman who had chosen to love a child who was not hers by blood, but entirely hers by heart. Jacob remained by her side, his presence as steady as the earth, and in the quiet that followed they both understood, without speaking, that they would not abandon this child. Hope had been pulled from the water by chance, but it was no accident that she was in their arms now. She was the fragile bridge between their past losses and an unexpected future. Hannah watched her tiny hand curl into a fist as she slept, and in that small gesture she saw the determination of survival, the defiance of despair. The name had been more than a word. Hope was becoming a truth they could not let go of, no matter what forces might soon rise against them. And in that moment, as night folded over the small town, and the world beyond their walls began to stir with rumors and secrets, Hannah and Jacob both felt the same quiet certainty settle deep in their bones. They would fight for her, whatever it took. The days that followed Sheriff Carter's visit passed in a haze of unease that no amount of routine could dispel. The clinic where Hannah had built her quiet, predictable life no longer felt like a refuge, but like the fragile center of a storm gathering beyond the horizon. Each time the door opened, she found herself bracing for the possibility that someone had come to take Hope away. The baby, however, seemed oblivious to the weight pressing on the adults around her. She laughed easily now, gurgled with delight at Jacob's clumsy attempts at peekaboo, and slept peacefully against Hannah's chest, as though she had never known the cold terror of the water from which she had been pulled. The fragile sense of safety broke one afternoon when Maria Lopez appeared at the clinic door. Hannah had seen her many times before, usually following a step or two behind the mayor's wife during town events or moving quietly through the pews at church. Maria had been in the Dalton household longer than most could remember, a figure whose presence was so constant that she had become invisible to many. But that day she was anything but invisible. Her hands twisted together nervously, her eyes darting to the street as though she feared being followed. Hannah welcomed her inside, sensing the woman's distress, and Maria spoke quickly, as if afraid that silence might steal her courage. She told Hannah what she had never dared to tell anyone else, that the baby lying in Hannah's care was not lost or abandoned by strangers, but the daughter of Rebecca Dalton, the mayor's only child. Rebecca had been just 19 when she became pregnant. To the Daltons, pillars of wealth and propriety, the scandal was unthinkable. They had sent her away, told the town she was continuing her education, and when she gave birth, her father had insisted the child had not survived. Maria's voice trembled as she described the nights she had heard Rebecca sobbing in her room, convinced that her daughter was gone. But the child had lived. The mayor had paid a man to rid the family of the shame, to make the infant vanish as though she had never existed. Maria had overheard enough of the hushed conversations to piece together the truth, and when she heard whispers of a baby found near the creek, her guilt had become unbearable. She could no longer keep silent, even if it meant risking her livelihood. The weight of her words left Hannah breathless. The pieces slid into place with terrible clarity. The inquiries at the sheriff's office, the sudden interest in a missing child. It was not grief driving the search, but fear. The mayor was not seeking a child he loved, but evidence of his crime. Hannah looked at Hope, who was gnawing on the edge of a blanket with cheerful oblivion, and felt cold anger rise inside her. This little girl had not been misplaced. She had been condemned, and by her own grandfather. Jacob listened in silence, his face set in grim lines. When Maria finished, he stood and walked to the crib where Hope lay. He lifted her gently, holding her against his chest as though to shield her from the cruelty of the truth. His voice when it came was low and steady. They would not give her back, not to a man who could order such a thing. Hannah met his eyes and saw in them the same conviction burning in her own. They had saved Hope once, and they would save her again. The confrontation came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days later, Richard Dalton himself arrived at the clinic. His arrival was a spectacle. A sleek black sedan pulling up to the curb, his driver hurrying to open the door, and behind him a man in a tailored suit who carried a briefcase as though it contained the law itself. Dalton was a commanding presence, broad-shouldered despite his age, with silver hair cut neatly and eyes the color of cold steel. He was used to being obeyed, and every gesture spoke of a man certain the world would bend to his will. Hannah was holding Hope when he entered, Jacob standing close by as if ready to bar the way. The mayor's gaze swept the room and landed on the child, and for the first time his polished composure faltered. His lips thinned, and though his voice remained steady, it carried an undercurrent of fury barely leashed. He said the baby was his granddaughter, that she had been taken from her family, and that he had come to claim her. His lawyer added smoothly that the family was prepared to provide the best of everything: money, education, opportunity that no one else could offer. Hannah's grip tightened on Hope. She felt the child shrink against her shoulder at the mayor's voice, and the instinct to protect surged stronger than fear. She answered evenly, telling him that this baby had been left to die, and that family was measured not in wealth or bloodlines, but in love and care. Jacob's jaw clenched, and his eyes burned with the anger of a man who knew too well what it meant to lose a child. He stepped forward, placing himself between Dalton and Hannah, and declared that they would not surrender her. Dalton's face hardened. He had not come to argue but to intimidate. Yet the sight of these two standing against him unsettled the certainty he carried like armor. He turned to his lawyer, who produced a stack of documents and spoke of custody hearings, legal rights, and family privilege. Dalton announced that Judge Parker would hear the case within the week. He gave them 3 days, as though granting a reprieve. But his eyes promised there would be no mercy. When he left, the air in the clinic felt heavier, as though the walls themselves had absorbed his menace. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and dread. News spread quickly in a town where gossip moved faster than cars on Main Street. Some whispered in sympathy, others in judgment. People took sides, some aligning with the mayor out of fear or loyalty, others quietly supporting Hannah and Jacob, moved by the sight of the baby who now cooed and smiled in the arms of those who had saved her. The line between compassion and cowardice cut through friendships, families, and Sunday congregations. And then Rebecca Dalton returned. Hannah saw her first through the clinic window, stepping out of a car with hesitant grace. She was thinner than Hannah remembered, her pale face framed by hair that looked as though it had lost its luster through months of sorrow. She entered the room with trembling hands and eyes that brimmed with a pain too deep to mask. When her gaze fell on the baby, she seemed to stop breathing. Hannah hesitated, then rose slowly and held Hope toward her. But the moment Rebecca reached out, the child began to cry. Not the soft whimper of discomfort, but a desperate, panicked wail. She twisted, reaching back for Hannah, clinging with tiny fists and sobbing the one word she had learned with clarity. Mama. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Rebecca's face crumpled as though she had been struck. She drew her hands back, covering her mouth as tears spilled freely. She whispered then, not to Hannah or Jacob, but to the child, confessing that she had been lied to, that she had mourned her every day, that she loved her though she had never held her. Her eyes lifted to Hannah's, pleading and broken, and in that moment the truth between them needed no words. Hannah saw not a rival but a girl who had been as much a victim of Dalton's cruelty as the infant now nestled against her heart. When Rebecca left, her father's commands sharp in the air, she turned back once more. Hope had ceased crying, her face pressed against Hannah's shoulder, but her eyes were open, wide and unknowing. Rebecca whispered across the distance that she loved her, even if the child did not know it yet. The words hung like a promise in the quiet, and then she was gone. That night, after Hope finally drifted to sleep, Hannah and Jacob sat together in the dim glow of the lamp. The house was silent, but neither of them could rest. The hearing loomed, a battle they had not sought but could not escape. Hannah brushed her fingers over Hope's hair and whispered that they would not let her go. Jacob nodded, his voice low and certain. They would fight, no matter how powerful the man they stood against. For the first time since her brother's death, Hannah felt not only the weight of responsibility, but the strength of resolve. Hope was no longer just a child she had saved. She was their future, fragile yet unyielding, and they would protect her with everything they had. The days shortened toward the hearing, each one pulling them closer to the moment when love would be measured against power in the eyes of the law. Outside, the town hummed with speculation, but within the quiet walls where a baby's laughter now rang, Hannah and Jacob prepared themselves. The mayor might command the town, but they held the heart of the child, and in that heart, they found a courage neither had expected to know again. The courthouse stood at the end of Main Street like a monument to the town's history, its brick walls weathered by decades of disputes and reconciliations, its steps worn smooth by the feet of countless citizens who had come seeking justice. On the morning of the hearing, the square surrounding it was crowded in a way Hannah had never seen before. Cars lined the streets, horses still tethered in a nod to the older families who clung to tradition. Townsfolk gathered in tight clusters, murmuring as though the trial were a spectacle stage for their entertainment. Yet beneath the chatter lay an undeniable tension. Everyone knew this was not simply a custody case. It was a confrontation between power and principle, between a man who had ruled the town for years and two ordinary people who had dared to stand in his way. Hannah arrived with Hope in her arms, Jacob steady at her side. The child was dressed simply in a pale yellow dress that Grace at the parish had sewn overnight as a gift, a symbol of the town's quiet solidarity with those who had shown love when others had shown cruelty. Hope clutched a small wooden horse Jacob had carved for her, its rough edges softened by her constant handling. She babbled contentedly, unaware that her very presence in the courtroom would carry more weight than any legal argument. Hannah felt the small body press close against her and drew strength from the warmth, though her own hands trembled with the knowledge of what lay ahead. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was heavy, the murmurs falling to silence as Judge Parker entered. He was a man respected for his fairness, his lined face and steady eyes a reminder that he had weathered many storms of public opinion without bending to them. He called for order, his gavel striking wood with authority, and the proceedings began. The mayor's lawyer, imported from Dallas with a reputation as sharp as the crease in his suit, rose first. He spoke of family rights, of lineage and bloodlines, of the duty of a grandfather to secure his granddaughter's future. He painted a picture of privilege and opportunity, of private schools and trust funds, as though these things alone could measure love. His words carried confidence, but behind them Hannah could hear the hollowness, the lack of acknowledgement for the truth of what had happened by the creek. When it was time for Rebecca to take the stand, the room grew hushed. She walked forward with hesitant steps, her face pale but her chin lifted, with a determination that belied her trembling hands. She swore the oath and sat, her voice low but clear as she spoke. She told the court that the child was hers, born months ago when she was 19. She described how her father had told her the baby had died, how she had mourned with a grief that consumed her nights. Tears filled her eyes as she admitted that she had loved her daughter, even when she believed she was gone, and that learning the truth had torn open wounds she thought would never heal. The lawyer guided her gently, asking if she wanted her daughter returned to her care. Rebecca faltered, glancing toward Hannah, toward Jacob, toward the baby who was smiling in the arms of the woman she had come to know as her mother. Her words stumbled. Yes, she said. She wanted to be a mother. She wanted her daughter. Yet even as she spoke, her voice wavered, and the court saw the truth written in the child's reaction, in the way Hope turned away from the sound of her biological mother's plea and reached instead for Hannah with outstretched arms. When Tom Bradley, the town's humble lawyer, rose to cross-examine, his tone was gentle but firm. He asked Rebecca how many times she had visited the child since her discovery, and her answer none, until the day at the clinic echoed through the room like an accusation she had made against herself. He asked what had happened when she tried to hold her, and Rebecca's tears flowed freely as she admitted that her daughter had cried, had clung to another woman, and called her mama. The silence that followed was more damning than any accusation could be. Then it was Jacob's turn. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his hands steady despite the storm inside him. His voice carried not the polish of a lawyer, but the raw truth of a man who had known loss. He told the court of finding the child at the clinic, of the nights he had spent rocking her to sleep, of the mornings he had risen before dawn to feed her, of the way she had filled the silence in his home with laughter that he thought he would never hear again. He admitted openly that he had no legal claim, no blood tie, no right except the one carved in love. She calls me Papa, he said, his voice breaking just enough to make even the sternest eyes glisten. And when she does, it heals a part of me I thought was dead forever. The lawyer from Dallas tried to shake him, pressing about the lack of formal guardianship, about his past grief as though it made him unstable. But Jacob stood firm, insisting that love did not need paperwork, that a child's heart knew her family even when the law had not yet recognized it. The courtroom, once divided, seemed to lean toward him as he spoke, as though his words reached something in them that wealth and influence never could. Hannah followed. She spoke of her profession, of the oaths she had taken to protect life, of the night she had pulled the baby from the sack and felt the last weak flutter of her breath. She told of how Hope had grown in strength under their care, how she had learned to smile and babble, how she had found safety in arms that had never once let her down. And then, with a quiet resolve, she revealed the truth of what Rebecca had confided to her years ago. She spoke of the bruises she had seen, the fear that had driven the young woman into silence, the control of a father who valued reputation over the well-being of his own blood. The courtroom erupted in whispers, but Judge Parker called for quiet, his expression grim as he listened. Rebecca wept openly now, nodding through Hannah's testimony, her father's mask of authority cracking as the town heard what had long been hidden. He stood in outrage, calling the claims lies, but the sight of his daughter collapsing beneath the weight of her own truth silenced many of his defenders. The people were no longer blind to the cost of his ambition. As the proceedings drew to a close, Judge Parker called for a recess. The courtroom emptied into the square outside, the townsfolk buzzing with disbelief and anger, but inside a quieter moment unfolded. Hope had grown restless from the long day, and as Hannah set her down in the aisle to stretch her legs, the child surprised them all. She tottered forward on unsteady steps, her wooden horse clutched in one hand, and walked directly into Jacob's waiting arms. Her voice, clear and small, rang out across the courtroom as she called him Papa. The moment hung suspended, every witness to it knowing they had seen something more powerful than any legal argument. When Judge Parker returned, the room hushed. He spoke with the weight of years in his voice, declaring that he had never presided over a case where the contrast between law and justice was so stark. He acknowledged the rights of blood relatives, but insisted that the law also demanded the best interest of the child. He cited the testimony, the evidence of abandonment, the history of abuse and deception, and then he delivered his verdict. Hope would remain with Hannah Miller and Jacob Reeves, the people who had given her life, stability, and love, when others had sought to destroy her. The decision broke like a storm over the room. Some cheered, others sat stunned, but the mayor's fury rose above them all. He shouted that it was an outrage, that his granddaughter had been stolen from him. Yet his words fell hollow now, the town already turning against the man they had once followed unquestioningly. He had lost not only the custody battle, but the respect that had been the foundation of his power. Rebecca approached quietly after the gavel had fallen. Her face was streaked with tears, but her voice carried sincerity as she asked if she might remain a part of her daughter's life. Not as a mother, she admitted, for that role belonged to Hannah now, but as someone who loved her and wished to see her grow. Hannah and Jacob exchanged a glance, and then Hannah reached out to take Rebecca's hand. Hope deserved to know her story, all of it, and she deserved every person who could love her with honesty. They welcomed her, and Rebecca, for the first time in months, allowed herself a fragile smile. Months passed. Spring gave way to summer, and in June the town gathered once more, not for a trial, but for a wedding. The church on Main Street was filled with flowers and laughter as Hannah and Jacob spoke their vows. Hope, in a white dress sewn by Hannah herself, toddled down the aisle scattering wildflowers, her delighted cries drawing smiles from every pew. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, the child clapped her hands and shouted, "Mama, Papa," sealing the moment with innocence that no one could dispute. The reception was modest but joyous, held in the church hall with tables laden with food prepared by neighbors who had once doubted but now celebrated them. Hope danced between her new parents, her tiny hands clutching theirs as music filled the room. Rebecca sat in the third row, tears in her eyes but a smile on her face, content to watch her daughter cherished in a way she herself had been denied. As the years unfolded, Hope grew strong and bright, her laughter echoing through the small home that had become the heart of their world. She called Hannah and Jacob her parents without hesitation, yet she also welcomed Rebecca as Aunt Rebecca, weaving her into the fabric of her life without confusion or shame. The town, once divided, came to see in her a symbol of resilience, of love triumphant over cruelty. Richard Dalton, stripped of his influence, lived out his days in bitterness, his power eroded by the truth he could not bury. On Hope's 5th birthday, the town gathered again, this time in celebration. She sat at the head of the table surrounded by those who had fought for her, her eyes bright with joy. When asked to make a wish before blowing out her candles, she looked around at the faces she loved and declared that she did not need to wish for anything. She already had everything she wanted, a mama and papa who loved her, and a family that had chosen her when the world had tried to throw her away. As she blew out the candles, not a single eye was dry. That night, as Hannah tucked her into bed, Hope asked for the story she always wanted to hear, the story of the morning by the creek. Hannah smiled, her voice soft as she began. Once upon a time, she told her, there was a baby who was thrown into the water, but she was stronger than anyone knew. She was found by people who had lost much themselves, and together they became a family. Hope drifted to sleep with that story in her ears, secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged, held in love, chosen not by blood, but by hearts that had refused to let her go. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Make sure to check out our other videos for more powerful stories, and share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.